Be careful of over-targeting with digital ads.
I'm Eric Wilson, Managing Partner of Startup Caucus, the home of campaign tech innovation on the right. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, you're joining in on a conversation with entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. Today, we're sharing the audio from a recent webinar hosted by the Center for Campaign Innovation discussing their 2023 Virginia Post-Election Survey, which was conducted in cooperation with the State Government Leadership Foundation. The full survey, including the slides referenced in the discussion, are available at the link in our show notes. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's conversation about the Center for Campaign Innovation's 2023 Virginia General Assembly Post-Election Survey. That's a mouthful. I'm Eric Wilson, Executive Director of the Center for Campaign Innovation, and we're also joined by David Konevsky from 3D Strategic Research, and he serves as our Research Director who conducted the poll. Also joining is Peter Barnes from the State Government Leadership Foundation, co-sponsor of the survey. Our discussion today focuses on three main highlights from the poll. The first being the perception of the abortion debate in voters' minds. Second, the effect of renewed Republican early voting efforts. And finally, the status of social media and digital streaming platforms. You can visit campaigninnovation.org to see the full top lines from our survey. Last year, Virginia's General Assembly, the House of Delegates and the Senate, was up for election. Our survey looked at 9 battleground districts, 4 won by Republicans and 5 won by Democrats. Republicans ultimately lost the House majority and Democrats retained the Senate majority. An early narrative that emerged following the Republicans' loss centered on the GOP's response to the issue of abortion post-Dobbs. 2023 was the first opportunity for state legislative elections in Virginia since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. That's simply a function of Virginia having kind of off-year elections. But our survey found that in these battleground districts, Republicans actually won the debate on abortion, with 51% of voters saying the Republican candidate supported reasonable limits on abortion, compared to 35% who said the Republican candidate was an extremist on the issue. In fact, this pattern held up even in districts where the Democratic candidate ultimately prevailed. Now, Dave, I want to turn to you. What was the overall role of the abortion issue in the election? How did it feature in the campaigns and voters' minds?
So what happened this year compared to previous years was really the salience of abortion. Abortion shot up to the top of the issue agenda. If you go back and look at the 2021 exit polls, abortion was at the bottom of the issue agenda. Just 8% said it was their top issue heading into that election. You compare that to 33% in 2021 who said the economy was the top issue. And then other issues like education was in second at 24%, taxes and spending and COVID were tied at 15% each. So in 2021, abortion was less important even than COVID as we were coming out of the pandemic. But in this year's state legislative races, abortion was the top issue at 35%, with the economy in second at 23%, and then crime and education were tied for 10% each. So the salience of abortion really increased in the post-Dobbs era, meaning GOP candidates needed to respond to the Dem attacks on abortion. And as the data you showed, Eric, it said that Republican candidates did a good job combating the Dem attacks. But then the question, some people may ask is, if abortion was the top issue and the GOP candidates did successfully portray themselves as reasonable on the issue, why did the GOP narrowly lose the majority? And that's, because we found while we did a good job pushing back on Dem attacks on abortion, rather than responding that Dems are extremist on abortion by the fact that Dems support late-term abortions and taxpayer funding of abortion, we found that was actually the least effective message. So the lesson from this is GOP campaigns should respond to the Dem attacks like they did in Virginia, that Republican candidates aren't trying to ban abortion, they support reasonable limits, but then pivot to another issue like education, for example. And some of that goes to the salience issue. Voters may think Republicans supporting a 15-week limit is reasonable because that's where voters are. but they're saying that's not really the priority of what I want you to do if you get elected, if you're in the majority, especially the median voter who decides who's in the majority or not. If you think back in 2021. There was a pretty clear sense of what Youngkin would do if he got elected. He would cut the grocery tax. He would open schools, support parental rights. He was pro-life, but he wasn't making abortion the top of the issue agenda. And so that's kind of one of the big lessons from this cycle in Virginia. Republicans should look to reduce the salience of the issue of abortion. Obviously, Democrats are going to try to make it more prominent. But again, go back and look at the Youngkin model in 2021. He was pro-life, but he didn't put abortion at the top of the issue agenda this year, whereas this cycle it really did become very prominent on what Republicans would do if they got the majority. I would describe it as it's the old "how do you eat an elephant" metaphor, one bite at a time. So particularly if you're in blue or purple states or districts, a Republican candidate can personally support a 15-week ban, but again, you may not want to make it the top of your issue agenda, or again, depending on your state, depending on your district, look at smaller victories to potentially get the ball rolling, like ending taxpayer funding of abortion or banning partial birth abortion.
So, David, did we see a partisan split there between the salience of the issue or the importance of the issue of abortion between Republicans, Democrats, Independents?
It was definitely at the top of the issue among Democrats. Like that drove their entire vote. I would need to pull up the crosstabs among Republicans and Independents. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, we got a question from one of our viewers, so I wanted to get that data for them. Peter, despite the media narrative, our data shows that these candidates, Republican candidates, effectively navigated the abortion issue. Walk us through how they did that and what conservatives learn from this going into 2024.
Thanks, Eric. Great question. I think one of the takeaways and one of the lessons for folks to I guess utilize and replicate is the legislative caucuses there, the Republican legislative caucuses got together and they all got on the same page and had one unified position. And I think that that led by the governor, there's only so much you can do when you have that much outside spending. But as you go and look into it, folks thought they're reasonable on the issue. They were talking about it in a way that relates to folks, and I think that would be the lesson, and that would be the advice that we give to that we give to candidates out there in legislative caucuses as they're evaluating policy positions is to build a consensus and get agreement amongst everyone, and then learn how to effectively communicate that. And that's what they did there in Virginia. And I think that it's a testament to the results with how well they did across the board. I think that it goes back to kind of what David said was once you touch this issue, though, you're gonna the other side has so much energy on it that you've got to be ready with resources and whatnot as well to be able to counter that. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that was really important for these candidates is to the extent that they were able to personalize the issue. And what I mean by that is talk about their own biography, whether that is as a father, a husband, or even a doctor. We saw several instances where these local candidates were able to, in a way, personalize this very divisive issue and actually kind of soften some of the attacks, right?
That's exactly right, and I think there was a verbatim in the poll as well that somebody said, "I know who this person is, I know what they believe, and that that this attack ad is not true." And that goes back to advice that our sister organization, the RSLC, gives out to to candidates on a regular basis of being out in your district, people may disagree with you, but if they know you and that you're likable and you're willing to answer questions, that you're gonna win more votes that way, and you're gonna appeal to a broader range of folks there. And so I think that's exactly right. And I think you'll probably get into it a little bit more, but I think it's the way you talk about the issue in general of Democrats we're coming out against Republicans of you're taking away rights, you're providing restrictions, and I think that Republican candidates or conservative candidates need to take that into mind and reframe the issue of how am I relating to these voters, how am I relating to mothers in this scenario, and whether that is what resources or what how are we being there for folks during this time, and making sure that that's how you're framing the issue versus the other way.
David, did you find that number for our comment here?
Yeah, so among Democrats, it was by far the top issue. 59% said abortion was the most important issue in their vote. But if you go look at independents, it was the second most important issue behind the economy. And then if you look at Republicans, it was actually the third most important issue behind both economy, crime, and then it goes to abortion. So abortion did matter to Republicans and independents, but much, much less than what it was really driving out Democrats.
Yeah. So now I want to move on to the issue of early voting. Obviously, the sound and the fury, certainly the media coverage on this election was about this abortion issue. But I think for voters going forward, there are some really important lessons to learn here, particularly around early voting strategy. So one of the things that we saw is that with a coordinated effort, the Republicans in Virginia were able to close the gap on absentee and early voting. It was a huge push from Governor Glenn Youngkin, his team, as well as both the House and Senate Republican caucuses, in addition to, of course, Democrats investing heavily in absentee ballot and early voting. Virginia, of course, is new to the no excuse absentee and early voting. We call it absentee in person, I think, just to be technical. And so this is new for a lot of voters. One of the things that we saw is that Republicans were able to keep pace with Democrats. We asked voters in this election, how did you cast your vote? Overall, 63% voted on Election Day, and we actually saw that number was pretty consistent across the board. Where the gap starts to emerge is, as we'll see in just a minute, on the outcome. But overall, Republicans and Democrats voted in roughly similar proportions. David, do you have any additional comments on this slide that we're looking at here?
No, I think it goes to what you're saying next, which is Republicans were voting early, but it was early in person versus early by mail, which is still a little bit more favored by Democrats.
Yeah. And so Republicans did win early in person and Election Day. So we then looked at the election results in these battleground districts, and we found that Republicans won the Election Day vote 52-47. That made up 64% of the vote. Early in person, 50-49%. That accounted for a quarter. And then this absentee mail, so the vote by mail is really where the big gap emerged. It represented just 11% of the overall vote, but obviously a decisive one, with Democrats winning 65-34% over the Republican candidates. So I want to shift now to who was voting early. The vast majority of those early voters, about 3/4 for both party, are reliable 404 voters. So these are the voters that show up consistently at regular intervals, especially in a state like Virginia where you do have those off year elections. And Peter, one of the questions that I get asked a lot when we're focusing on these vote by mail early voting efforts is people will say, aren't we just cannibalizing our Election Day voters? And so based on these two data points, the answer is yes and no. What's going on here, really?
Well, I think this election you've got to take in the frame of the issue that drove the most new voters to the poll, and I think that you saw that on the Democratic side, and so you can't just take this in a vacuum. I think that yes, an absentee early voting program moves stuff forward, but I think we have an obligation, and we saw it in programs ran by a sister organization where we net increased overall voters out there, folks coming in that were had previously not voted. So I think that we've seen this where we banked 36% of our vote, and that ended up being a 3% increase of in voters there. And so I think that says yes, there's success there. But some of the lessons learned out there are, all right, well, what are you going to do to make this better? How are you going to expand it? And we've got to do a better job at persuading voters to become voters, persuading right. folks to show up, and that whether that's on Election Day or whether that is in early voting. And I think that all goes into whatever how you're communicating to a voter. That should you should take that into an account. And you've seen several special elections out there where they've used kind of unique, patching calls to identify folks, and then once they figure out the issue that they have, they're continuing to contact them until they show up and go vote. And I think that for Republican campaigns to be successful, you've got to see them continue to invest in early and absentee ballot programs on top of their existing infrastructure, and that is going to take away from Election Day, but that's fine. You just have to go find more Election Day votes out there and convince more folks that are persuadable, that are low propensity voters, and that is possible, and that's stuff that we've seen in this poll. But we've also some of the research from our sister organization, the RSLC, has done in some of their efforts to, there's a possibility out there. And what it comes down to is a commitment to resources on the campaign side for doing that. So
yeah, and I think these numbers paint a really important picture for campaigners out in the field, which is, yes, your most reliable voters, those 404 voters, are going to be the ones most likely to vote early. But if you are a conservative looking at this and seeing, okay, Republicans won on Election Day, they won in early person, but then got trounced in the vote by mail, that you can maintain those margins by pulling forward some of those reliable voters and then freeing up your resources to go chase after those infrequent voters who are with you on key issues. So we've got more work to do in terms of research of what kind of cost savings does that do for a campaign or a issue advocacy organization to get those voters marked early, which segues into our next slide here. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, the one thing I would also point out is there's another slide that folks should take a look at, but it's a portion of the stuff that's available, but it talks about when voters made up their mind, and I think that was a very intriguing. That was a very intriguing kind of seeing when voters had decided which candidate they were voting for and then why they were voting for. And I think that's kind of. Folks should just, it feeds all into, the point that, Eric, you were just making, but also, there's all these other underlying factors that are there too. And so how do you use those factors to make yourself more successful as well? So,
Dave, that had jumped out to you as well as a key insight from our survey, the deciding early.
Yes. So the majority of voters are deciding before September. And again, these are state legislative races. And as we always used to think about state legislative races was, well, that's what people always decide on later. You may know how you're voting for president, maybe for U.S. Senate, but your state legislative candidates, you need to find out more about them. But as even those races have been kind of driven by partisanship, the majority of voters are voting early. But what is interesting is the people who are deciding late are much lower propensity voters. So rather than at the end of a campaign where people kind of really tighten their funnel of who they're targeting, there's something to be said for opening up your funnel to kind of talk to these low propensity voters at the end, because that's when they really start tuning in.
So a couple of things that we learned from our survey, we asked voters, why did you vote the way that you did? And it surfaced some pretty helpful insights, I think, for practitioners who are looking at implementing their own get out the vote strategies in 2024. So 45% of voters who cast a ballot before Election Day, either by mail or in person, said convenience was the main reason. They were skipping the line. They were marking it off of their list. Conversely, 21% of those Election Day voters said that they actually don't trust early voting or vote by mail due to concerns about security and fraud. That is going to be a present challenge for candidates and efforts as you try and shift attitudes about early voting and vote by mail. 30% of Election Day voters spoke about the tradition of doing so. So you think about, going to the polling place, seeing people from their neighborhood, getting the literature, arguing with your friend who is in a different party. Those sorts of aspects are traditions. And importantly, speaking to the work of SGLF, the Spirit of Virginia Republican State Leadership Committee, a number of organizations, 72% of Republicans reported being encouraged to vote early, compared to just 52% of Democrats. So the messaging, the outreach on vote by mail and voting early certainly reached the target audience, and that's one of the reasons that you saw the gap close when it came to AB and EV. Dave, what are some takeaways for campaigners from these insights as they start to make plans for 2024?
First, recognize there's still some resistance to absentee and early voting among Republicans. That's a residual of the Trump messaging in 2020. If you look at states with a long history of absentee and early voting, again, in Virginia, it's kind of new, but look at a Florida, which has had it for, multiple cycles. Republicans used to win the absentee mail vote in Florida prior to 2020 and Trump telling voters not to trust mail-in ballots. So when you look at that 21% of people who don't trust early voting or absentee voting, that's overall. Among Republicans, that jumps up to 31%. It becomes the big reason why Republicans aren't going to vote by mail or go vote early. And that's part of why Republicans need to outwork Democrats on absentee and early voting, because Republican voters have heard messaging from Trump and others making them not trust it. So how do you overcome that kind of lack of trust is having trusted messengers. We saw in open ends that multiple Republicans cited encouragement from Governor Youngkin that created the permission structure to vote absentee and early. And when you hear from trusted leaders saying it's okay and you can secure your vote via absentee and early voting, that makes it easier to convince the Republicans, hey, you should do this. Tradition is really tough to overcome. We actually saw some of that back in 2022 when we look at a state like Pennsylvania, which just started absentee mail. Absentee mail. A lot of election day voters like that tradition of going to their polling place. They go with their kids, their spouse. It's a routine. Part of that is they think it's actually convenient. It's a lot easier to go to the polling place on their way to work than it is to go to maybe a much further early voting center, for example. So the challenge of changing tradition among high propensity Republicans to go from election day to absentee early voting, that may be a little bit of a lift. So instead, where Republican campaigns should look is at low propensity Republicans, people who don't really have that kind of tradition baked in. And there, what you're trying to do is shift them from not voting at all to voting absentee or early by stressing the convenience of it. If your state has a permanent absentee list like Virginia does or New Jersey does, when you do voter registration, you should be encouraging them to sign up for the permanent absentee list. Republicans used to do that in Arizona for a long time. So it becomes easier for those low propensity Republicans to vote because the ballot automatically gets mailed to them. And then it becomes really easy for a campaign to chase that. Hey, we know you got your ballot. Please don't forget to return it. And part of it was, just to put it in context, both parties struggled with kind of converting low propensity voters into absentee and early voting. But let's put it in context. This was the off year. The top of the ticket was the state Senate race. So this is the lowest turnout you see outside of primaries. And that's why most absentee and early voters were high propensity 304 and 404 voters. As we think into, a presidential election or even an even year midterm, I think you're probably going to get a little bit more ability to move low propensity voters into absentee and early voting. And one thing I'd encourage some campaign to do an A/B test to see if, voters who are really annoyed by all the texts, the calls, all the voter contact they get from campaigns, if you start telling voters, hey, we'll stop bothering you if you go return your ballot, will that convince some Republicans okay, I'll go do this? We've seen anecdotal evidence of that in like these really, really high profile like special elections like a Georgia 6 or places like that, but would love to see an A/B test on that tried somewhere.
Yeah, the leave us alone tactic. So, Peter, one of the things that jumped out to me from this survey is how important to the voters the issue of convenience and getting something done was. And so that hasn't figured into our messaging a lot, but I think there's huge potential there for people to explore more of like, it's your civic duty, be a good person and vote, but go ahead and get it marked off your list, do it from home, vote in your pajamas, some sort of messaging like that. Were there anything here that kind of jumped out at you from our findings about asking voters how and why they voted the way they did?
I think the civic duty, and then also kind of the was one thing, and I think it's more of like underlying in some of the other crosstabs that are in there, but civic duty, and then just honestly the likability of candidates. But I think that when folks were bringing those for reasoning, it kind of reinforces a lot of the lessons we've been talking to folks about in terms of how candidates should be communicating to their voters and to folks there.
Yeah, so we got a couple of questions about the methodology from the chat, and one was is this what people told you they did from the polling, or did you look at the actual turnout? Obviously, we weighted it to the results of how people voted, but for these verbatim questions, these are self-reported. We asked people, how did you vote? Do I have that correct, David?
Yeah, we did ask it, but Virginia did report on election night what percent of people voted early by mail, voted early in person. And so we had a very minor weight, and it lines up very much with the actual results.
And then we had another question. How did these early voters vote before the pandemic? Obviously, that's something that we weren't doing a longitudinal survey here. But I can imagine that we had many voters pre-pandemic being ABEV, because I worked on statewide campaigns in Virginia in 2014 and 2017 when it was still required excuse. And it was sort of like, I think it was like 13 different excuses that you had to that you could select from before you would be eligible to be on that mail-in list. And so that's something that we had to educate voters on. It's obviously just exploded in the last couple of years since they got rid of the no excuses. All right, now let's turn our attention to the issue of platform and media fragmentation and what this means for campaigners. I think aside from the insights about how do you talk about vote by mail and early voting, this is the biggest wake-up call that we have for people going to voters in 2024. So let's start with our social media platforms. It's a question we ask in all of our surveys. Which social media platforms or apps, if any, do you use? There's really important insights that we get that aren't anywhere else because we're looking at voters and specifically what platforms they're using. So Facebook is still at 60%. It's still the dominant social media platform for most voters. But we did find that voters are using a lot of different platforms, especially when you look at younger voters. And so there's a fixed amount of time in a given day, and they're using more platforms than ever before. And so what that tells us is that they're spending small bits of time on a bunch of different platforms. Increasingly, we are seeing these platforms not allow any political candidate or issue advertising. So, for example, LinkedIn, which is part of the Microsoft network, continues to be against political candidate advertising. TikTok prohibits political advertising. Pinterest and Nextdoor. So it certainly limits the opportunity for campaigners to reach voters on these social media platforms. The news isn't any better when we look at streaming services. Netflix leads with 39% of voters. When you look at people who have streaming services, it is the dominant leader as well, of course. And although Netflix are rolling out an ad-supported plan this year, political ads for candidates will not be allowed. That was an announcement that they made last year. So again, kind of the wake up for campaigners is that streaming is not going to save us when it comes to the challenge of cord cutting. So it is, streaming is not going to be a perfect replacement for TV because these platforms. So if you look at Netflix does not allow political ads, Amazon Prime Video does not allow political candidate ads, and if you're like me, you're getting ready to decide whether you pay $3 a month to get ad free or just endure the ads on Prime Video. Disney Plus does not allow political advertising. Apple TV Plus. So really limiting those options for advertising. Dave, what does this data tell us about how campaigns should be buying streaming ads in 2024?
First, rather than building your budget around broadcast and then filling in other mediums, I would say it's more about buying deeper across multiple platforms. rather than increasing your buy on existing platforms. Eric, you had a good analogy on an earlier podcast episode that rather than kind of fill your broadcast bucket and then move over to the next bucket or whatever buckets you're trying to fill, kind of try to fill in each bucket a little bit at a time. And I think that works well. And what I mean by that on buying deeper is think about all the different walled gardens and platforms that are out there that may be part of your ad strategy and kind of look at all of them holistically before you move to broadcast. So obviously Hulu and YouTube are a big part of digital ad buying given their reach, but have you thought about, a Spotify, a Pandora, iHeartRadio? What are all these other, not just audio, but other digital platforms that you should kind of look, given how fragmented the audience is? And then the other thing is also be careful of over-targeting with digital ads. Some of these platforms, particularly the ones that let you upload voter lists, I wouldn't necessarily cut off low propensity voters, or in some cases even Democrats, on your digital audience, since we see that low propensity voters over-index on digital. The reason, if we think back to 20, 30 years ago, why broadcast television was so powerful in the day was because the big three networks hit everyone. It was like a nuclear bomb. You couldn't escape it. So you want to kind of recreate that with your digital ads by buying across multiple platforms so people can't escape it. But that also means kind of removing some of the targeting, except for maybe just avoiding that kind of waste you have for out of your district stuff. So unless you have a specific message for a specific audience, if you have a Social Security message that really is only for seniors, or a pro-Israel anti-Semitism message that's really targeted to Jewish voters, you might want to remove the targeting options on digital outside of geography. If it's an ad you would put on a broadcast television audience, like a spot to build name ID or a negative on your opponent, then you don't necessarily need a hyper-target when you put it on a digital platform.
I can't stress for people enough how important it is to be flexible in how you are buying right now. There is so much change going on. Just set aside the politics in the digital advertising industry, period. You have iOS 14, the iPhone software operating system, taking the wind out of the sails of a lot of ad tech companies, making it more difficult to target voters. The cookie is going away as an advertising option. So there's a lot of change going on. And so I don't think anyone has this figured out on what do we do. The sort of halcyon days of being able to precisely target a voter with Facebook that we were enjoying back in 2014, 2016, those are gone. And so it's going to take some trial and error and experimentation. We also saw cord cutting tip in this survey, by which I mean, this is the first time we saw in these battleground districts that more voters were only reachable via digital streaming than by TV alone. So that's the first time that we've seen that happen in one of our surveys since we've been doing this going back to 2020. So it just shows you how quickly the cord cutting challenge is progressing. And so then when you go into our key groups, like the lower propensity voters, they are more readily reached on streaming platforms than TV. So you look at these low propensity voters, almost a quarter, 1 in 4, are totally unreachable. And so when we say someone's unreachable, we mean they're not watching broadcast or cable TV, they're not watching linear TV on a streaming service, and they use streaming services that we can't advertise on. So that's starting to create a big black hole for reaching these voters. One of the reasons I'm so concerned about this is I think it's also going to create kind of a doom loop of civic participation, where if you are someone who is only watching Amazon Prime and Netflix to consume video content, you're not going to be reminded to go out and vote in elections. You're not going to be informed about what the issues are. And so you're going to fall off those voter rolls and people aren't going to reach out to you anymore. So it's a big concern. The cord cutting and unreachable challenge continues for our swing voters, so independents, persuadable voters. They are over-indexing for streaming and digital only. So, Peter, with all this good news, what should campaigners do with these insights as they prepare their media plans for 2024?
I think we said it earlier, but reiterating it, there's a ABEV kind of low propensity voter strategy that is separate from and additional resources from your traditional campaign. But I think that your traditional kind of who you've been targeting over the years to maintain and then add to it. But I think it applies to both both of those, that you're going to have to use other methods. The good old trusty mail, phones, door knocking.
Still reaches everybody.
Still reaches everyone, and I think it's going to take using David's example of you don't just do broadcast and then attach everything else after that. It's hey, who are the people on these different platforms that I can get to? All right, we've figured out different ways to get and reduce that unreachable amount. Where they may only be on the internet, they may only be on TV, or you may just be getting them by phone. But I think one of the other interesting things that is important is folks sometimes just oversimplify that this applies to urban, suburban, rural, young and old. This is not going away, and so it's going to take. I think folks, now is the time to get educated on it and actually spend time rethinking how you approach campaigns to account for this change in behavior, because it's only going to fast forward from this point forward.
Yeah. Now I want to encourage everyone to go to campaigninnovation.org. You can read our full analysis, get access to the top lines, and do feel free to reach out if you want to discuss this further. We also have some time for questions. Question here about what actions could be taken to ensure people are registered or want to switch their party affiliation in Virginia. For better or worse, we don't have party registration, so that certainly makes it easier for people to participate in these primaries. Obviously, party registration doesn't matter in the general. In terms of getting people to turn out in the primaries, I think it becomes an education issue of letting people know that if they want to vote for a candidate, so this this adds a little bit of a wrinkle to your messaging strategy. If they want to vote for your candidate, they're going to have to go through this extra step, and fortunately you have the data to be able to do that. Dave or Peter, have you seen anyone building some sort of program like this? Nothing is jumping out to my mind, but perhaps you know of an example.
To my knowledge, there's still groups out there that are still focusing purely on registering in that route, but I don't know from a direct campaign. I've not seen that.
Again, it's state by state. It depends on what the rules are in each state and how you do it. Like in New Hampshire, there's a primary today when we're recording this. If you're an unaffiliated, it's really easy to kind of change your registration when you go vote in a primary. You just affiliate with it, and then you can unaffiliate as you walk out. Things like that. In terms of who's done it well, this is something you actually want to give the RNC and the Trump campaign credit for. If you look at states like North Carolina, Florida, in the Panhandle, Louisiana, Oklahoma, these are states where people were ancestrally Democrat and never changed their registration until Trump and the RNC came along and said, hey, you should change your party registration. And Louisiana just changed their laws, so they're going to have closed primaries. I imagine there's going to be a big push to get people who are conservative Democrats to re-register. But again, it's really state by state, depending on kind of what the context of those states are and their rules.
If they have an early voting list, if they have, this, that, like, I have seen, we've heard from and seen, and, as part of, some of the stuff that, our different groups work on, of that is a part of getting folks to, building Republicans onto those permanent early vote lists, so that they're in, and unaffiliateds that vote Republican in primaries. And so that's North Carolina. It's an open primary system. So it's, getting they don't have a list, but, reaching out and making sure that those folks are showing up for those primaries. And so, Arizona is another one where, they're spending time, utilizing all legal means necessary in catching up there and finding those folks that, may have been lost or may have been new, but there are people and getting them on the list too. So,
Dave, we had another question here about streaming services. Is there one that sticks out amongst lower propensity voters as opposed to voters writ large, or did it pretty much break down? If I'm recalling correctly, it was the same pattern of like Netflix is number one and then Amazon Prime. It sort of roughly matches the kind of market share of the streaming services, if I recall correctly.
Correct. Yeah, it does. There's a slight over-indexing on YouTube, but it's still not number one. It's kind of generally in order. And a lot of it is also related to age. The younger you are, the more likely you are to stream. Again, even among seniors, we found only 52% of seniors were TV only. So what you're seeing is almost half of seniors are also watching streaming in some kind of capacity. But it does skew a little bit younger, and it's pretty similar across the board.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that jumped out to me, even since we've did this poll, is how quickly the adoption of streaming services is advancing, and there's going to be consolidation, I think. But anyone who was being tech support for their family so they could watch the football game on Peacock knows well that there is a play by these streaming platforms. I actually just saw earlier today that Netflix is going to start getting Monday Night Raw from the World Wrestling Entertainment. So they're starting to get into their own live events. Of course, political candidates not allowed to advertise there, but we're really seeing a push to get everyone, even older demographics, into streaming.
Coincidentally enough, was listening to kind of the media, the business of sports or whatever, and they were talking about, there was a former ESPN exec that said, hey, if we could air the Super Bowl behind a paywall for our pay-per-view, we would do it. And I think that's the exact example that with Peacock of, you're going to see that with all of these companies over the next couple of years, where they know they have to boost those numbers for their own balance sheet. So it's only going to become more of a problem for us. So
Michael Beach at Cross Screen Media had a really good newsletter recently where he talks about basically football, live sports are keeping the TV industry afloat, and they constantly get the highest ratings. So as we see them even give up on TV, it's really just going to accelerate this. So a lot of challenges ahead as we try and tackle this. I think, if we were to fast forward, we're going to be doing another post-election survey at the end of this year. But we don't know what the outcome's going to be. But I think that we can safely say the winner or winners in contests are the people or the campaigns that are able to figure out this fragmented social media and digital or TV landscape and figure out how we bundle all of this attention back together to be able to reach voters, turn them out, persuade them. I'll put you on the spot, Dave and Peter. Any predictions along those lines as we look at this data from 2023?
Again, the number that really stood out to me, and you highlighted it, was this was, we've done this survey for several cycles in several states. The fact that this was the first electorate we've looked at where more people were either streaming only or unreachable than were linear only was huge, shocking news. And when we saw it, is this related to the districts we specifically looked at in Virginia, as opposed to if we looked at statewide, these were very inner suburban areas. Is that related to that? But also keep in mind, because it was an off year, it actually was a little bit older than what you'd see it as in a presidential. And older voters are still a little bit more linear only. Therefore, you would expect that to kind of tamp down this streaming only unreachable. So I'm really excited to see what those numbers come at the end of this cycle, what we see. But what I would say is, obviously, everybody's spending a lot of time, money trying to figure out, how you advertise on streaming, how you measure its impact, who you reach there. The one thing that really did stand out to me is we did see about 1 in 5 people meet the candidates. We saw about almost half of people got a door knock. The one place where I think there's still a lot of room for growth in the political tech space is relational organizing. People weren't really hearing from their friends, their neighbors, kind of their trusted contacts. And as we think about how people kind of are kind of becoming more firewalled, the whole kind of bowling alone thesis, you're less connected to people, and you're also less connected to the news because you're not watching linear TV. So who is that trusted messenger to a swing voter, to a low propensity voter? It may not be an ad we serve to them. It may be somebody that they know that we have to kind of reach out to them. So again, is that influencer advertising? Is it relational organizing rather than just sending out door knockers to just knock doors en masse? Have your volunteers talk to the people they know. I think those are kind of where I really see some opportunity for growth for campaigns.
Yeah, I keep coming back to this image, Dave, of the shepherd going out to find the lost sheep. You leave the 99 behind to go get that one because that one is so valuable and could tip the election. So That's sort of the image that keeps coming to my mind as you talk about, you may not be able to get them on streaming, but you got to go off and knock on their door or show up at their event. Peter, any final thoughts before we wrap up our conversation today?
Just building on Dave's comments or thoughts was, I think it's, the winners are going to be the campaigns that are, that build out a plan, but also are testing the results as they go along. So not just, hey, we're just going to go with what we've always done, but, as they're starting to see results, from different mediums and how they and the types of folks that they are reaching and kind of adjusting based on that. And I think that goes into the whole campaign ecosystem. So folks that don't just you're not just worrying about one type of outreach, and so really spending that time of diversifying. But then what are the messages that you need to be doing? Whether it's door knocking, whether it's mail, and not just building your candidate's image, but also convincing folks on issues and the way to go about it on the different mediums, because I think that has quite a bit, and I think folks that are investing in data early to identify the types of they may be folks that look exactly like existing voters, they just have never been talked to, and then figuring out the way to get to them. So.
Yeah. Well, my thank you to David Konevsky from 3D Strategic Research and Peter Barnes from the State Government Leadership Foundation for joining us for a great conversation today. Remember to check out campaigninnovation.org to get more details about the survey and to find out about future events. Thanks to everyone who joined us live, and for those of you who are listening to the recording, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. The Business of Politics show is produced by Advocacy Content Kitchen, a media production studio.